Podcast Talk.
Learn English naturally.
How to learn English on your own. Learning English alone sounds simple until you actually try to do it, because at the beginning you feel motivated. You download apps, you watch videos, you make plans, but then life gets busy, energy drops, and suddenly studying feels like something heavy instead of exciting. And that's the moment when most people quietly stop. So today we're talking about how to learn English on your own without losing motivation and without feeling overwhelmed.
Emma, I think the hardest part about learning alone is that nobody sees your effort. When you go to a class, you show up, you participate, and you feel progress because there's structure. But when you're alone, you can spend an hour studying and still feel like nothing changed. I remember when I tried to improve my French by myself, I would sit at my desk, open a textbook, and after 20 minutes, I'd feel bored and distracted. Not because I didn't care, but because the process felt disconnected from real life. And that's when I realized something important. Learning alone only works when you connect the language to your daily routine. Not just on study time, but real moments. Listening while cooking, thinking in English while walking, reacting to videos out loud. That shift changed everything because the language stopped feeling like a subject and started feeling like part of my day.
Yes, Jake. And I think many learners underestimate how emotional learning alone can be. Because when you're by yourself, there's no external validation. Nobody tells you, good job. Nobody corrects you immediately. And sometimes you start doubting if you're improving at all. I've talked to so many people who said they felt stuck, but when we looked closer, they were actually making progress, just slowly and quietly. That's why building small habits is so powerful. Not big dramatic study sessions, but simple routines like listening to English every morning or speaking a few sentences before bed. Those small actions build confidence because they prove to you that you're consistent. And consistency is what turns learning from a stressful task into something stable and natural.
Another thing I've noticed is how important it is to remove perfectionism when you learn alone. When nobody is watching, you have the freedom to experiment, to make mistakes, to sound imperfect without pressure. But many people still imagine an audience judging them, and that stops them from speaking out loud. I used to do that too. I would wait until I felt ready, until I knew enough words, until my pronunciation felt perfect. But that moment never really comes. Progress starts when you accept that learning is messy and imperfect. When you allow yourself to speak, even when you hesitate, even when you repeat words, even when you pause. Because communication is not about being flawless, it's about being understood. And once you shift your focus from perfection to expression, learning alone becomes much more enjoyable.
And I think that's where self trust grows. When you learn alone, you start understanding how you learn best. Maybe you remember words through stories, maybe through repetition, maybe through listening. You begin to notice patterns. When your energy is highest, what helps you focus, what makes you feel confident. And that awareness is incredibly valuable because it turns learning into a personal process instead of a fixed method. I always say that learning alone is not about discipline only. It's about curiosity. When you stay curious, you naturally explore more, you notice new expressions, you become more comfortable with the language. And over time, That comfort becomes confidence.
I also think learning alone teaches patience in a way nothing else does. Because progress doesn't feel dramatic, it's subtle. You don't wake up fluent one day. Instead, you notice that you understand conversations easier, that you translate less in your head, that speaking feels smoother. Those small changes are easy to overlook, but they're real signs of growth. And when you start noticing them, motivation becomes internal instead of external. You don't need someone to push you. You keep going because you see the change yourself. That's when learning becomes sustainable.
You know, Jake, I think one of the biggest surprises when you learn English on your own is realizing how much your mindset affects your progress. Because at first, most people focus only on methods, which app to use, which course to follow, which videos to watch. But after some time, you understand that consistency comes from how you talk to yourself, not just what you study. If you keep telling yourself that you're slow or that you're not good at languages, every small difficulty feels like proof that you should stop. But when you start treating learning like an experiment instead of a test, everything feels lighter. I remember a period when I stopped measuring my progress by how many new words I learned and started noticing how comfortable I felt during conversations. That shift changed my motivation completely because learning stopped feeling like pressure and started feeling like growth. And I think that's something many learners miss. Progress isn't just about knowledge. It's about confidence slowly building in the background.
That's so true, Emma. Because when I was learning on my own, I kept looking for the perfect system instead of building a simple routine I could actually stick to. I would jump from one method to another every few weeks, thinking the next one would finally make everything click. But the real problem was that I wasn't giving anything enough time to work. At some point, I realized that progress doesn't come from intensity. It comes from repetition, even when it feels boring. So I started doing small daily habits instead of long study sessions, like listening to English while walking or repeating phrases out loud during normal tasks. And slowly, without noticing, my brain stopped translating everything and started reacting naturally. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't fast, but it was real progress. And I think that's the part people underestimate. Learning alone isn't about motivation bursts. It's about creating an environment where English becomes part of your normal day.
Yes, and something else happens when you study on your own. You start noticing how much pressure disappears when there's no classroom comparison. There's no feeling that someone else is moving faster, no silent competition, just you and your pace. And that freedom can be incredibly powerful if you use it well, because you can focus on what actually interests you instead of what a curriculum says you should do. I remember choosing topics I genuinely cared about, like psychology podcasts and everyday conversations. And suddenly, learning didn't feel like studying anymore. It felt like curiosity. And curiosity is such a strong driver because you don't need to force yourself. You want to understand more. That's when vocabulary sticks deeper, pronunciation improves naturally, and you start feeling more connected to the language instead of just memorizing it. And I think that emotional connection is what turns self-learning from a struggle into something sustainable.
Exactly. And I think people often believe that learning alone means learning without support. But that's not really true anymore. You can build your own environment with podcasts, conversations, communities, and even talking to yourself out loud to practice ideas. I used to record myself explaining simple topics just to hear how I sounded, and at first it felt awkward. But over time, it became one of the most effective exercises. Because when you speak freely, you discover what you actually know versus what you only recognize when listening. And that awareness helps you focus your practice in a much smarter way. Instead of guessing what to study, you see clearly where you hesitate or search for words. And that kind of feedback loop is incredibly powerful when you're learning independently, because it keeps you moving forward without needing external pressure.
And there's also something really empowering about realizing that you don't need perfect conditions to improve. You don't need hours of free time, expensive courses, or a perfect schedule. You just need small, consistent moments where English becomes part of your normal life. I've seen people improve simply by changing their phone language, thinking in English during simple tasks, or narrating their day quietly to themselves. These tiny habits may seem insignificant, but over months, they completely change how comfortable you feel with the language. Because fluency isn't built in big dramatic moments, it's built in thousands of small interactions with the language. And when you start seeing learning this way, it stops feeling overwhelming and starts feeling possible.
I think the biggest mindset shift for me was understanding that mistakes are not interruptions to learning. They are the learning. When you study alone, there's no teacher correcting every sentence, so you learn to notice patterns yourself. At first, that feels uncertain, but over time you develop a kind of intuition about what sounds natural. And that intuition grows every time you speak, listen, or try to express something slightly more complex than before. I remember moments when I realized I could explain ideas without planning every sentence, and that felt like a real breakthrough. Not because my grammar was perfect, but because communication felt easier. And that's the real goal. Not perfection, but comfort and clarity when expressing your thoughts.
You know what I've also noticed, Jake? When you learn English on your own, you start building a much more personal relationship with the language. It stops being something you have to do and becomes something you use to understand the world around you. I remember the moment when I caught myself thinking in English without trying, just reacting naturally to something I saw or heard, and it felt almost surprising. That's when you realize learning isn't only about knowledge, it's about exposure and comfort. And comfort comes from seeing the language in real contexts, conversations, stories, real emotions, not just exercises. When you connect English to your real life, even simple phrases start feeling meaningful instead of mechanical. And that emotional layer makes everything stick longer because you're not just memorizing, you're experiencing. I think that's why self-learning can be so powerful when you approach it with curiosity instead of pressure.
That's such a good point, Emma, because curiosity changes the entire experience. When you're curious, you stop worrying about being perfect and start focusing on understanding and expressing ideas. I remember listening to conversations and trying to notice not just the words, but the rhythm, the pauses, the way people react to each other. That helped me understand that real English is not about speaking fast or using complicated vocabulary. It's about sounding natural and clear. And once you start paying attention to that, you realize how much communication is about tone and intention, not just grammar. Learning alone gives you the space to observe these details without feeling rushed, and over time, you begin to mirror them naturally. It's almost like training your ear first, and then your voice follows. And that process makes speaking feel much more relaxed instead of forced.
Another thing people don't talk about enough is patience. When you're learning by yourself, progress can feel invisible for a while, and that can be frustrating if you expect quick results. But language growth is often quiet. You don't notice it day by day, only when you look back after a few months. Suddenly you understand more, you respond faster, you feel less nervous speaking, and you realize all those small efforts were building something bigger. I always tell learners to pay attention to comfort instead of speed, because comfort is a much more reliable indicator of progress. If you feel more relaxed listening or speaking than you did before, you are improving. And when you shift your focus from how fast to how natural, the whole process becomes much more enjoyable. That's when learning stops feeling like a task and starts feeling like growth.
And I think enjoyment is such an underrated part of learning, because when you actually enjoy the process, consistency becomes much easier. You don't need to force yourself every day. You just return to it naturally because it feels interesting. I remember replacing some of my usual entertainment with English content, shows, interviews, casual conversations, and it never felt like studying. It felt like normal life, just in another language. That shift made a huge difference because I was getting hours of exposure without feeling tired or overwhelmed. And the more you surround yourself with the language, the more familiar it becomes, until it stops feeling foreign. At that point, speaking becomes less about effort and more about expression. And that's when you realize you're not just learning English, you're living with it.
Yes, and living with the language also changes how you see mistakes. Instead of feeling embarrassed, you start seeing them as natural steps in communication. Everyone who speaks a language fluently has made thousands of mistakes along the way. That's just part of the process. When you accept that, you remove a huge amount of pressure from yourself. I remember feeling nervous about sounding imperfect, but once I allowed myself to speak freely, I noticed how much faster I improved. Because the goal isn't to sound flawless, it's to be understood and to connect. And connection always matters more than perfection. That mindset makes speaking feel lighter, almost like a conversation instead of a performance. And that shift is incredibly freeing.
I completely agree, Emma, because confidence doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from trusting that you can communicate even when you don't know every word. That trust grows slowly through experience, through trying, through real conversations. I think many learners wait until they feel ready, but readiness actually comes from practice, not from waiting. The more you use the language, the more natural it feels, and the fear gradually fades into familiarity. And once you reach that point, English stops being something you study and becomes something you use without thinking too much about it. That's when you realize the real goal was never perfection. It was freedom to express yourself. And learning on your own can absolutely lead you there if you stay consistent and patient. Learning English on your own takes patience, but every small step builds real confidence over time. What matters most is staying consistent and continuing, even when progress feels slow. If today's conversation helped you feel more motivated, that means you're already moving forward. Subscribe to Off Script English for more real conversations like this. And tell us in the comments what topics you'd like next. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.